American criminology in particular has generally focused on local geographical areas coming from the Chicago School. So they've studied the ghettos and barrios and marginalized areas. But they've failed to do a couple of things, and basically they've failed to do this for about 80 or 90 years. One thing is they do very little comparative work. So they look at American gangs, but they don't look at gangs anywhere else. In fact, they don't even compare gangs between, say, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York City. They don't even look within the country at different comparative forms of gangs. So it really limits, when you draw some conclusions about describing a gang, it really limits your whole view and perspective of the gang, and it fits in a nice kind of hermetic pattern of social ecology which comes out of the Chicago School. The second problem with a lot of mainstream American criminology is they don't read anything that's not in English. So you have tons of studies coming out of Latin America or even from Europe, Germany and France, that might not fit the mould of the Chicago School and obviously written in a different language. And mainstream criminology never incorporates any of these other studies historically into our work. And then the third thing is they're kind of stuck within a kind of modernist framework still of what is a gang. For so much of the lexicon and the vocabulary of gangs is still tied to society as if it was still industrializing, right? We live in a post-industrial society, and many of our youth live in a de-industrial society. That's why they call it the Rust Belt in the Midwest and so on and so forth. So for them, the old notion of the Chicago School was that gangs were kind of a symptom of social disorganization and anomie, caused by people immigrating from rural Europe and were sort of thrust up against the changes of industrialized society. But over time, over generations, 1 or 2 generations, they would learn to acculturate and adapt and assimilate, and the gang would wither away. This, of course, is not the case. We see, in fact, more black gangs and Latino gangs now than we've ever seen in our lifetime, despite all the repression from law enforcement. So what's all that about? We have to really then rethink where we're coming from in terms of gang criminology and bring it up into a kind of a framework, or couch it in a framework which is basically about late modernity or even post-modernity, but certainly not the modernity that we've been using or thinking about, which was the old kind of gang imaginary, if you like, of old criminology. We need a new criminology, a much more critical criminology, to bring us up to take into account the new kinds of gangs which now occur on the global arena and not simply at the local level. Gangs are fundamentally cultural phenomenon, right? That some of them have a whole economic basis, a drug basis. Some of them are very social. Some of them are about fighting and defending territory. They have a range of forms. But according to law enforcement, a gang is only a group of youth. Usually, actually, a definition is 2 or 3 people, right, in a group at minimum that commits criminal acts repetitively, right? There's tons of gangs that that don't create that kind of havoc and don't create that kind of threats to society. So we have to go back to sociology. You don't bring into the definition crime if you don't know that's what they're actually involved in. That's the role of social science. And that's what makes the big difference between social science and cop science or police science, because the police science is tautological. Right? It goes out to find what it wants to find. It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Our notion of social science is that we have to go out and prove what is out there in social reality. And many times what is out there in social reality, it contradicts our assumptions about what should be out there. But the great thing about sociology or criminology is once we find a different kind of evidence, once we find different data, then we change our theory, or we extend our theory, or we develop our theory, and we think about it differently. Police never do that. They never change in that sense. And especially in the last 20 and 30 years, in the new kind of punishing society, the security state, it's kind of one criminogenic generalization upon another. Right? We see gangs consistently as not just as criminals or putative criminals, we now see gangs as terrorists. We have absolutely no evidence at all, right? We simply have this hearsay from police talk and police talking to others, going around giving seminar after seminar about the new threat without any kind of comparing it to the data and the evidence. There's a complete divide between what social science finds and what police or policing science finds. Gangs emerge historically when young people are trying to make sense of the contradictions of daily life. But they don't have the power, right, to change those contradictions, to really affect those contradictions. Right? They don't have the power, they don't have the class power, they don't have the wealth, they don't have the resources. So what they do is they form cultural organizations or subcultures, right, to address these extraordinary contradictions that they face in everyday life. It's a culture that makes sense to them. It gives them a sense of who they are, a sense of being, a sense of identity, a sense of place. The role of culture now, especially for many of our millions and millions of surplus youth around the world, is fundamental to everyday life. If you go up today in most of the world's cities and you're poor, you really don't have a future. You live by birth in a parallel society. And so in these parallel societies, culture becomes absolutely fundamental. Your identity, who you are, becomes absolutely fundamental. Right? And the gang culture is enhanced in those cut-off societies, right? In those excluded societies. And the gang actually becomes institutionalized. It becomes a cultural way of life that goes on from generation to generation to generation. The Latin kings in this country didn't start in the 1980s or 90s, it started in the 1940s. Right? The White Fence Gang in Los Angeles started in the 1930s. So you've got multiple generations of gangs that are now fundamentally part of these cut-off societies in which the culture is perpetuated. The myths of the gang are handed down from one generation to the other. And these kids are living in these myths. And this role of culture is enhanced, of course, by the internet. Kids can go online and become part of what one researcher called a virtual street corner society. Right? That's why you have Bloods and Crips, you know, in the Philippines. Again, they become symbols, right? They become symbols of evil, which is a cultural issue, and they become symbols of clothing, symbols of style, symbols, right, of music within hip-hop, gangster rap, right? This is all part of, so it's this very complex cultural kind of set of dynamics which are in place all round, hovering around the axis of the gang. Now that is a big difference in the last several decades. So gangs have become prolific as part of global culture, as part of global urbanization, as part of global poverty, and terribly importantly, as part of global policing. Because what we're doing now around the world is that we're adopting the American notion of zero tolerance and security policing, and we're adopting it to almost every society. We're seeing this extraordinary level of incarceration and inclusion of the gang, and yet what's the end result? The gang expands exponentially. All over the place, Latin America, in the Middle East, right? And if you look at the movements in Tunisia, right? At the moment, the people on the street, many of those people on the street are the most socially excluded, linking with middle-class students who have an education and nowhere to go with it. Right? We have this is what's going on in the new post-industrial capitalist society. You're getting gangs now beginning to develop a political rhetoric, right? A political set of goals, right? Because they have in their kind of cultural milieu are uniting with other kind of leftist movements, anarchist movements, and are beginning to develop new imaginations, new visions of what that society could be.